Good morning. This is Omni View, episode 112 for July 14th, 2026. Multiple perspectives, one briefing. We'll cover what happened, how different viewpoints frame it, so you can decide for yourself. Sam Neill's death at 78 closes a chapter for generations who grew up with Jurassic Park and the piano, underscoring how individual careers shape shared cultural memory across decades. Spain's government received nearly 1 million applications for legal status, almost double the 500,000 it had expected. The surge reflects broader patterns of migration and regularization efforts in the country. Al Jazeera presents the development as evidence that official estimates often understate demand when pathways to status are opened. Government-aligned voices stress the economic contribution migrants make once regularized. Critics of expansive regularization argue the higher numbers indicate weaker border controls than previously claimed. Why might governments consistently underestimate application volumes for regularization programs? Shifting now to developments in Sudan. A Sudanese court has sentenced General Hemeti, commander of the Rapid Support Forces, to death in absentia on charges including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, particularly in West Darfur. France 24's regional reporting stresses the court's focus on specific atrocities in Darfur as the basis for the verdict. Supporters of the ruling see it as an attempt to establish accountability even when the accused remains outside the country's control. Others note that in absentia sentences can complicate future peace negotiations because they remove incentives for the individual to engage directly. What legal and practical limits exist when courts issue verdicts against individuals not in custody? Next, a local election development in the United Kingdom. A new poll indicates BEV Craig is likely to succeed Andy Burnham as Greater Manchester Mayor, securing 38% of the vote in the first round and prevailing in a runoff against both Green and Reform candidates. Daily Mail coverage highlights Reform's loss of support to a harder right option as a sign of fragmentation on the right. Labour sources interpret the same numbers as evidence of steady voter preference for the party's local record. The poll's emphasis on a second-round runoff draws attention to how ranked choice mechanics can reward broader second preferences. How do local mayoral races differ from national elections in the issues that dominate voter decisions? Turning to financial markets, Treasury yields increased as market expectations rose for additional Federal Reserve interest rate hikes ahead of the June inflation print. CNBC frames the movement as investors pricing in tighter policy to address persistent inflation. Bond market participants see higher yields as a signal that the central bank retains credibility in its inflation-fighting role. Some analysts caution that repeated hikes risk slowing growth more than anticipated if inflation data proves softer than expected. What relationship between inflation data and bond yields do markets assume when adjusting expectations? Meanwhile, environmental concerns have surfaced in Nigeria. Residents in the Niger Delta town of Bile have protested over toxic, flammable gas leaking from the ground, contaminating water and harming aquatic life that supports local livelihoods. France 24 links the leaks to ongoing operations by Western oil companies, emphasizing cumulative community harm. Local residents stress immediate health and economic threats from contaminated resources. Industry observers often point to the technical difficulty of containing leaks in aging infrastructure, while acknowledging repeated past incidents. How do long-term environmental complaints in oil-producing regions typically intersect with questions of corporate responsibility versus regulatory enforcement? In France, authorities are responding to a wildfire. Firefighters are tackling a major fire burning since Sunday in Fontainebleau forest near Paris, and 2 people have been arrested on suspicion of arson. Deutsche Welle presents the arrests as part of efforts to determine whether the fire was deliberately set amid high summer risk. Local authorities stress the danger to a heavily visited natural area close to the capital. Environmental groups often use such incidents to highlight the need for stronger prevention measures during dry periods. What investigative steps typically follow arson suspicions in large forest fires? Le Slip Français plans to debut on the Paris stock market on Tuesday, positioning locally made clothing as an alternative to low-cost international competitors such as Shein. CNBC frames the listing as a bet that some consumers will pay more for domestic production and perceived quality. The company's strategy assumes that sustainability and origin labeling can command a premium even as fast fashion volumes grow. Market watchers note that successful IPOs in this segment remain uncommon amid dominant low-price players. What consumer assumptions about price versus origin does the company's approach test? How do stock market debuts affect smaller brands' ability to scale against larger competitors? Why might investors view domestic manufacturing as either a strength or a constraint in apparel? The FCC authorized Reflect Orbital to launch the Mirror satellite Earendel-1, intended to reflect sunlight and provide illumination at night. The European Southern Observatory has warned that the project poses an existential threat to optical astronomy. Wired emphasizes the regulatory approval process and the scientific community's concerns about light pollution affecting observations. Supporters of the project highlight potential practical uses for nighttime illumination in remote areas. Astronomy organizations stress that even small increases in sky brightness can degrade data quality for ground-based telescopes. What trade-offs exist between proposed commercial uses of orbital mirrors and the needs of scientific observation? How do regulatory bodies weigh competing claims when approving new satellite technologies? Why might incremental changes in night sky brightness have outsized effects on certain research fields? Oil markets moved sharply on geopolitical news. Oil prices rose after President Trump announced plans to impose shipping fees in the Strait of Hormuz, reviving supply concerns following the breakdown of an earlier ceasefire. CNBC links the price movement directly to renewed geopolitical tensions and the threat of restricted tanker traffic. Gulf producers are exploring alternative routes to maintain exports. Economists note that sustained higher prices could influence inflation and interest rate decisions in multiple countries. How do announcements about maritime fees translate into immediate price shifts in global oil markets? Two suspects reportedly told investigators that the mastermind behind last year's daylight theft of 88 million euros in crown jewels from the Louvre expressed dissatisfaction with the proceeds. Daily Mail coverage focuses on the internal dynamics among the alleged perpetrators and the scale of the theft. Law enforcement accounts often use such statements to illustrate how expectations in high-value crimes can diverge from reality. Museum security discussions tend to examine whether the operation exposed gaps in daytime protections. How do investigators use statements from lower-level suspects to build cases against organizers? What does the reported disappointment suggest about planning assumptions in major art thefts? Why might daylight operations on high-profile targets carry different risk profiles than nighttime ones? A report found that male detainees at an immigration center had been caught looking through the windows of women's bedrooms. Daily Mail presents the incidents as evidence of inadequate separation and oversight within the facility. Advocacy groups focused on detainee welfare often call for improved physical design and staffing to prevent such breaches. Facility operators typically cite resource constraints while acknowledging the need for stronger safeguards. What design or procedural changes are commonly proposed after privacy incidents in detention settings? How do different stakeholders weigh security needs against the dignity of all residents? Why might reports of such incidents surface through official inspections rather than internal channels? Now, to really understand this story, there's something most coverage leaves out. Most coverage of sudden surges in applications for legal status assumes governments can accurately forecast demand, yet the Spanish case shows projections often fall well short. In practice, regularization programs combine public announcements with administrative capacity that may not scale quickly when uptake exceeds expectations. The process usually requires applicants to prove residence, employment, or family ties, creating backlogs that test both bureaucratic systems and political support. Knowing this, when you hear claims that only X number will apply, You can evaluate whether the figure reflects modeling or political messaging. Next time you see a headline about migrant applications, ask what documentation standards are in place. How long do approvals typically take, and what happens to those whose cases remain pending after the initial window closes? Tomorrow, watch for market reactions once the June inflation data arrives and whether they alter expectations around Federal Reserve moves. That wraps up today's Omni View. Remember, the best informed people read more than one perspective. If this show helps you do that, share it with someone who values fair coverage. See you tomorrow. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen: Unintended Consequences. True stories of good intentions that backfired. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. The age of AI puts real builders on the phone with an AI host. Apply at naranetwork.com/age-of-hiphapply. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.